Okay, so we are now talking about the analysis of the Section GG data and how they're used actually to calculate the quality measures. So as with all presentations, obviously we use a lot of abbreviations in this presentation, so they are on the slides. You also have a copy in your packet. So the objectives for this particular segment, so this is about an hour and about 60 slides. So the objective of this session is that following this presentation, you'll be able to identify key components of a quality measure. You'll be able to describe the IRF functional quality measures, and that you'll be able to identify resources that detail measure calculation specifications. So as part of this presentation, I'll be giving you an overview. I'll be telling you a little bit about calculation, but I'm not getting in depth into things like risk adjustment. I will reference it, I'll describe a little bit about it, but won't get into talking about calculations and all of that. But that information is available for those of you who are really interested in that detail, and I'll share with you the resources. So the key components of a quality measure, which are very important, are, first of all, a target population. Second, quality measures often have numerators and denominators. So you heard actually Terry talk about the numerator and denominator related to the DRR. So I will be talking about three measures actually in function that have numerator denominators, and two of the other measures don't have a straight numerator denominator. There are also exclusion criteria for some quality measures, and so we'll talk about that. Obviously, you need data in order to do the calculations, and so there's data elements associated with quality measures. There's a risk adjustment approach for some quality measures where that's appropriate. We'll talk a little bit about what is risk adjustment and why it's important. And then there's a calculation algorithm. So as I mentioned, there are several functional quality measures. The first one, application of the percent of long-term care hospital patients with an admission and discharge functional assessment and a care plan that addresses function, is a process measure. This was one of the first quality measures that was adopted into the quality reporting program. There are also 4 functional outcome measures, and when I say outcome measures, that is end results of care, improvement related to function. So 2 of them are in the area of self-care, and obviously are based on the data that Manisha covered this morning related to self-care, and 2 of the measures are related to mobility. So we're going to first of all talk about the process measure, which is an NQF endorsed measure, 2631. And basically this measure was developed for the long-term care hospital setting initially. That's why that name is in the title. And it was adopted and modified for use in the IRF quality reporting program. And data began with the collection in October 2016 for this measure. So basically, an overview of this measure is that, again, it is a process measure that calculates data, that is calculated from data from the IRF-PAI for the IRF setting. It was implemented across all the post-acute care settings based on the requirement of the IMPACT Act, the Improving Medicare Post-Acute Care Transformation Act of 2014. And this particular measure reports the percentage of all patient stay-level records with an admission and discharge assessment that addresses function and a care plan that addresses function. A treatment goal provides evidence that a care plan was established. So when I talked about, and when Manisha talked about the data elements included on the IRF-PAI, you had on admission the first column, which was performance, and the second column, which was a discharge goal. And the discharge goal basically represents the evidence that a care plan was developed for the patient. So again, the documentation of at least one goal for the function items, either self-care or mobility, reflects that the patient's care plan addresses function. The function goal is recorded at admission, And again, it's at least one self-care or mobility goal using either the 6-level rating scale or one of the activity not attempted codes. So it is acceptable that you pick either one self-care or one mobility items, and you can use the 6-level rating scale or 07, 88, 10, or 9. So the process measure is actually a measure that has a numerator denominator. And in this case, I'm going to start with the denominator because that's, the target population basically. So that is who is included. And for the IRF-PAI, as you know, you actually submit IRF-PAI data for Medicare Part A and the Medicare Advantage or Medicare Part C patients. And so the denominator, the number of people included in the measure, is basically the number of IRF-PAI records you submit, which is the number of Medicare Part A, Part C patients. I should actually note that if a patient is admitted multiple times, so not a program interruption, but like there's a stay 1 week and a stay, a week later, though that patient would have 2 IRF-PAI records submitted, and that there would be 2 records included in the quality measure calculation for that one individual patient. So it's a number of IRF-PAI records that you submit that's the denominator. So then among that group, the numerator is the number of patients or the number of stays with functional assessment data for each self-care and mobility activity on the performance side and at least one self-care or mobility goal. So basically for all the records that come in for the time period, so let's say the time period was calendar year 2018, anybody discharged in calendar year 2018, IRF-PAI record submitted, and if there's self-care and mobility performance scores for the items that are included in this measure, and there's at least one self-care mobility goal, that record will go in the numerator. In general, IRFs have been doing very well on this measure, so I think you probably already have this under control, but basically that's what the measure is. So just to kind of go through the details, in some instances, patients may not complete their stay. A person might leave on an emergency basis. And so for this measure, we actually have 2 slides, one that refers to patients who have complete stays, and the next slide will refer to patients who have incomplete stays. So for patients who have complete stays where they're discharged to home, or maybe there's a planned discharge to a next setting, there are actually 3 components that will be looked for in order to determine if that record belongs in the numerator. And so the first thing to look for, number 1, is a valid numeric score. So that's one of the 1 through 6 codes indicating the patient's functional status, or one of the activity not attempted codes for the admission assessment. Second is going to be also on the admission assessment, and that relates to the goal. So at least one valid numeric score, so the 01 to 06, indicating the patient's expected level of independence by discharge, or a valid code indicating that you're expecting the activity will not be attempted at the time of discharge. The third component that is reviewed in order to determine if a record belongs in the numerator relates to the discharge assessment, and this is a valid numeric score indicating the patient's functional status, or a valid code indicating the activity was not attempted for each of the functional assessment items on the discharge assessment for this measure. For those patients who have an incomplete stay, CMS recognizes that if somebody has a medical emergency, if somebody has like a pulmonary embolism, that is not the time to see if somebody can eat or walk. And so the functional assessment data, Section GG self-care mobility data, are not required. And so on the IRF-PAI, as you know, there's a discharge destination, so we can see people are being discharged to acute care, or somebody's discharged to an inpatient psychiatric unit, or somebody leaves AMA. So there's a definition of incomplete stay. If the patient meets that criteria, or the stay meets that criteria, then the discharge data is not needed, and so you see two components needed here: the admission assessment data, a goal, because on admission you expected the person to have a complete stay. If the person, again, has this incomplete stay, the discharge data are not required. So for this particular quality measure, because it was developed for cross-setting use, so as I mentioned, it's used in LTACs, IRFs, SNFs, and home health agencies, there's actually only 3 self-care activities that are required, that are looked at for this particular measure. When we get to the functional outcome measures, those dressing items are included, but for this particular quality measure, there's only 3 self-care activities that are included. On the mobility side, it includes some of the bed mobility activities. Actually, roll left to right is not included here, but it does include some of the bed mobility activities, some of the transfer items, some of the walking items if somebody's walking, the 50 feet with 2 turns, 150 feet, and if somebody uses a wheelchair, the wheelchair activities. So this quality measure, as you probably get a sense, being a process measure, is not risk adjusted. If a patient is quite ill, or a patient is perhaps one of your less sicker patients, you can code every single item, and the patient's complexity doesn't affect whether you can code or not, because if somebody's complex, you can use one of the activity not-attempted codes for several of the activities, and that you get credit for that as part of this measure. So basically, completion of the functional assessment, which includes the use of those activity not attempted codes, is not affected by medical or functional complexity of the patient. Therefore, risk adjustment of this quality measure is not warranted. So basically, the quality measure is just the numerator denominator that I described. If you're interested in more information about this quality measure, CMS has put together a functional measures page, and so all of the details across all the settings are on that page, but there's one IRF document that we put together that lists out all of the IRF measures in a kind of general broad sense without a lot of the technical details. So now we're getting into the outcome measures. So the first outcome measure that I wanted to cover is 2633, NQF 2633. So this is an NQF endorsed measure for the IRF setting. It's called IRF Functional Outcome Measures, Change in Self-Care Score for Medical Rehabilitation Patients. So this is an outcome measure calculated, obviously, from data from the IRF-PAI. It estimates the risk-adjusted change in self-care, and that's the change between admission and discharge among IRF patients aged 21 and older. The change in self-care score is calculated as the difference between the discharge score and the admission score. So I'm just going to make up numbers here. If somebody comes in with a score of 20, they leave with a score of 40. The change is 40 minus 20, which equals 20. So the change would be 20 for observed. It gets risk adjusted after that, but in general, it's a change score. So in this case, the target population, so the individuals who are included in the measure are IRF patients who are at least 21 years of age, Medicare beneficiaries, because as you know, you're submitting Medicare Part A and Medicare Advantage data to CMS, so all the Medicare beneficiaries are included. It includes people who are not independent on all the self-care activities at the time of admission. Probably you don't have many people who are getting coded 6 on everything on admission, right? So that's mathematically, somebody can improve if they come in at 6 on each of them, but the items were designed so that people would not be at the top of the scale on admission generally. And then for this measure, it only includes the patients who have complete stays. And the logic behind that, obviously, is, as I told you before, if somebody has a medical emergency, you're not required to collect the discharge data, and so I can't calculate a change score if I don't have discharge data. And again, the idea behind this exclusion is that The purpose of this measure is to demonstrate the effectiveness of your rehabilitation program, and if somebody wasn't able to complete the treatment plan, the care plan, there might be other things that really are related to the person needing to emergently be being discharged for that pulmonary embolism or other event that happened. So there's two sets of data elements that are included in this measure for the calculation. So the first one, obviously, is the admission and discharge functional status data. So Manisha covered self-care activities. I covered the mobility activities. So those items are included in the calculation. The other thing that's important about this measure is that it is risk adjusted. And so there are risk adjustment data at the time of admission that are included as part of this particular measure calculation. So the activities that are included in this change in self-care quality measure are all of the 7 activities for self-care that were covered this morning. And just to give you an idea about how the change in self-care is calculated, so this does get a bit technical, but just basically on admission, the scores, as you know, can range from 1 to 6. And with 6 higher indicating more independence. For the activities that are coded with one of the activity not attempted codes on admission, those codes are actually recoded to a 1, dependent. Generally, if somebody is not able to perform an activity, they're dependent in an activity, they tend to be fairly disabled, and so the current approach is to recode those activities to 1. So basically, after that recoding, every item, each of the 7 activities will have a code of 01 through 06. So those are actually added together to get the admission score. So you have the 7 activities with a range of 1 through 6 each, so you can get up to a 42 on admission. And then the same thing happens at discharge. The items are recoded so that they are all ranging from 01 to 06. They are added together, can be up to a number 42. Next, in the process of calculating the measure, you have to think about who's included and who's excluded. And so when we do the analysis, we identify the stays that are excluded. So as I said, incomplete stays are excluded, individuals under 21 are excluded, and so those exclusion criteria applied, so you're only left with the records that are included. And then we calculate an observed change score for each patient, or each patient stay. So again, if somebody's had multiple stays during a calendar year, they will be included. However many stays they have, they'll be included multiple times. And then after each patient stay has a calculated observed change score, there's a facility average that's calculated from all the records for the time period, and the measure has a 12-month time period, so if it's calendar year 2018 data, we're looking at all patients discharged during that time period. Their average change in self-care would be calculated. And for those of you who are interested, there is a lot of detail that goes on after that related to risk adjustment, but to ensure that anybody who wanted to replicate the calculation, the details include how many decimal places to include at every step of the calculation where it's relevant. So if you wanted to calculate your own data, you'd be able to do that with the same specifications. So as I said, risk adjustment's an important piece of this particular measure and actually the remaining measures. So as you are aware, patients treated in IRFs vary in terms of their primary diagnoses, their demographic characteristics such as age, and coexisting conditions such as comorbidities, or maybe the fact that somebody has a swallowing problem, or maybe has incontinence, or has pressure ulcers. So patients may have different expected functional improvement in self-care for this measure based on the reason that they're admitted, their primary diagnosis, their comorbidities, their age. Therefore, we risk adjust the measures. So risk adjustment, in general, controls for the specific patient characteristics that may affect the patient functional outcomes, so that when the average change in self-care is compared across facilities, there's been a level of the playing field, so it's a fair comparison. So just to give you an idea about the factors that we do have for risk adjustment, there are age group, admission function, and because of the relationship between the admission function and the change in function, we actually have we have a regression model that we use. So there's actually the admission score just that you calculated that can be, 7 to 42 that I described earlier. And then we also have basically that value squared in order to model the data that we see. We also adjust for primary diagnosis. So for example, individuals who have experienced a stroke tend to have different functional recovery if they come in at the same level for admission function than somebody who's maybe had a hip fracture. And so we adjust for primary diagnosis. We also adjust for whether they had surgery or not. In general, what we found with our data is that regardless of diagnosis, individuals who had surgery, major surgery, prior to the IRF admission, they tend to have better outcomes. So we adjust for that. We look at prior functioning. So Manisha covered those prior functioning. And so I would imagine it makes sense to you that somebody who had a stroke, let's say 2 years ago, and now have a second stroke, and they're getting admitted for that second stroke, if they had deficits, functional deficits, impairments that remained from that first stroke, we wouldn't expect them to have the same recovery as somebody who's maybe, if they've just had one stroke. And so we adjust for that. So again, all of this data that Manisha covered this morning are used as part of this process. We've also found in our analyses that patients who are admitted with pressure ulcers have less functional improvement than individuals who don't have pressure ulcers. In fact, what we found is a stage 2 pressure ulcer, well, I should say actually, having a stage 3 or 4 or unstageable pressure ulcer, they tend to have less improvement than somebody who even just had a stage 2 pressure ulcer. And so again, our analyses showed these effects, and so they are risk adjusters. And as you can see, we also found cognitive function at admission made a difference, communication impairment, bowel and bladder continence, swallowing ability, as well as comorbidities. So if you're interested in the details, for example, which comorbidities, those details are available in a document that I'll be covering at the end of this presentation. But what I want to convey as part of this is that there are a lot of data that are on the IRF-PAI that are used in order to do as much as is supported by data, supported by evidence for risk adjustment. So as I said, there is this document, and in the green bubble, the document is called the IRF Quality Reporting Program Measure Calculations and Reporting Users Manual. That's where all the details are, so you get all the information. For example, this is one of the tables that we spent a lot of time working on, but as you can see at the top, we have the age groups. So this is just the top part of this table because it goes over multiple tables, over multiple pages, excuse me. But basically you can see the age groups are less than 35, and then we have kind of a category 85 to 90, and you can see exactly how that's calculated from the IRF-PAI item. So obviously we take into consideration the person's date of birth and their admission date. So if you asked me, do you calculate age based on admission or discharge? You can actually get that type of detail here because it tells you in that third column, it's item 12 and item 6 that we use. And then the other detail that we have in here, in case you're interested, is that for somebody's age, you're not the next year older until it's your birthday. So we basically truncate. So if you're 29, you will be 29 until your birthday of where you turn 30. So that's the truncate instruction there. So again, all those details are there if you're interested. I mentioned that there's some exclusions. So for this particular measure, there are 6 exclusion criteria. So first of all, the incomplete stays. So we talked about that a little bit. Patients who are independent on admission, and again, mathematically, if somebody's admitted and they're coded independent on every activity for self-care on admission, there's no room for improvement. So basically, those individuals are excluded, but that's obviously rare. Also, when we were developing the measures, we did meet with experts over actually the course of multiple expert panels, and we asked clinical experts and researchers to identify patients who might have perhaps unpredictable functional improvement, who might be admitted to an IRF, or individuals who might have very little improvement because of various medical issues. And so, as you see in number 3, we exclude individuals who are in coma or persistent vegetative state, because sometimes it's hard to know who might actually recover and be able to perform daily activities. And so, again, there are these exclusions based on input from expert panels. The idea of the exclusion criteria is similar to risk adjustment. When CMS calculates a change in self-care risk-adjusted value, they want to be sure that it's fair to compare the data across centers. And so if one facility specializes in taking care of patients who are very complex, they should not be at a disadvantage because they take those complex patients. And so exclusion criteria also help to kind of level the playing field. Individuals under 21 are excluded, and that's in part because there wasn't a lot of research for individuals who are under 21 who are Medicare beneficiaries and their functional outcomes, and there was very little data being submitted, and so we weren't able to really recommend including those individuals without that evidence base. Individuals discharged to hospice are also excluded. The idea here is that in general, somebody may be admitted into an IRF, and perhaps they're during the stay, something is discovered or something worsens that wasn't expected, and so that person ends up being discharged to hospice. So probably functional improvement, it may have been a goal on admission, but maybe during the stay something happened that's no longer a goal, and so those individuals are excluded. And then, of course, Medicare does not have data for non-Medicare patients, so those patients are not included in the measure. If you're interested in more details about this measure, it is available on the NQF website. There's actually lots of details there, and so you're welcome to find that there if you're interested. I spent a lot of time on that measure because it's the first measure, but this second measure, which is NQF 2634, has a very similar approach, but this one is related to mobility. So 2634 is the IRF functional outcome measure, change in mobility for medical rehabilitation patients. Again, it's an outcome measure. It estimates the risk-adjusted mean change in mobility score between admission and discharge. Again, it's for people, individuals 21 years and older, Medicare beneficiaries. Change in mobility calculated the same as the approach for the self-care, but obviously the mobility activities. And the target population is essentially the same. Individuals who are 21 years and older, Medicare beneficiaries, but of course in this case it's individuals who are not independent in all mobility activities. And I'm going to guess that you do not probably have many people who are admitted walking up and down 12 steps independently on admission. That be true? Okay. All right, so this outcome measure again includes a collection of the GG data that Manisha covered, and that, or I guess I covered the mobility, admission and discharge, and then also the risk adjuster data. The items included in this particular measure include all the bed mobility activities, the transfer activities, the walking activities, the steps, and pickup object. So similar to what I described for the change in mobility scores, it's the same process. Obviously, more activities. There's 15 activities that are included in the mobility measure, and so there's a wider range, 15 to 90 for the admission score, 15 to 90 for the discharge score. The same recoding occurs. So, of course, on admission, not everybody is assessed doing a car transfer, so any activity not attempted codes will be recoded to an 01. And as part of the process, the admission mobility score is calculated for each person after the recoding. A discharge mobility score is calculated for each person after recoding. Excluded stays are identifies. The included stays are identified. The calculation of the observed change in mobility is calculated for each individual, and then an average is calculated for all patients in the performance period. So again, if the performance period is calendar year 2018, anybody discharged in calendar year 2018 would be included. And that would be the facility observed average, and that's one of the pieces of information you get on your reports, and there's risk adjustment that happens after that. Similar to the self-care items, we did a lot of analyses. We talked to a lot of experts about what factors are associated with mobility outcomes. In general, you'll see a lot of the similar admission data that are included in terms of risk adjustment. One thing I'll highlight is that number 19 on this particular slide, history of falls. In our analyses, we found history of falls was related to the change in mobility score, but it was not related to change in self-care. So that's included in this particular risk adjustment model, but it was not included in the self-care model. So there are differences, but as you can probably maybe remember, many of these are similar. So obviously primary diagnosis, whether you're looking at self-care mobility, that makes a difference. Stage 2 pressure ulcers did make a difference also here for the mobility quality measure. Again, if you're interested in the details, this document that I mentioned before called the IRF QRP Measure Calculations and Reporting Users Manual, the details are in this table. In fact, because so many of the risk adjusters are similar and how they're calculated is similar, you'll notice that there's 4 columns in this table. The first 2 columns relate to the change in self-care and change in mobility measure, and so you can see exactly which risk adjusters are included in both measures. In this case, all the age categories are included in both measures. Similar to the exclusion criteria that we talked about for the change in self-care measure, the 6 exclusion criteria are basically the same here. The biggest difference, obviously, is number 2, patients who are admitted independent, have a code 6, on all mobility activities at the time of admission. Again, if you're interested in details, you can go to the NQF website. This is measure 2634. I think if you go to this website, you have to do a disclaimer to actually get to this web page, but all the details are there. Okay, so now we're moving to some different measures. So the same function data are used, but these measures are more targeted for consumer understanding. And so they are calculated differently, but they use a lot of the same data. So this particular measure is NQF number 2635, and this is called the IRF Functional Outcome Measure Discharge Self-Care Score for medical rehabilitation patients. This particular measure is also an outcome measure, and again calculated using the IRF-PAI data. In this case, this measure is an estimate of the percent of IRF patients who meet or exceed an expected discharge self-care score. So I'll talk a little bit about the expected score in a minute, but basically the idea is that we're looking at a numerator denominator measure here, and it's a percentage. So you have all the patients who were discharged during the performance period, and then you're going, part of the calculation identifies the percent of patients who meet or exceed this national benchmark. The target population is the same as the other measures, IRF patients who were at least 21 years of age, Medicare beneficiaries, and have a complete stay. So just like the other measures, without discharge data, you're not really able to look at functional improvement, and so those patients who have an incomplete stay are excluded. For this outcome measure, the same 2 types of data are used. The section GG function data are used, and also the risk adjuster data are also used. So I mentioned there's a numerator denominator for this measure, and we're going to start with the denominator again because that's kind of the starting point, and everybody who ends up in the numerator must have been in the denominator for this measure. It's a percent value. So the denominator is the total number of Medicare Part A and Medicare Advantage or Medicare Part C patients who had stays with submitted IRF-PAI records and had a discharge date during the target period, and these individuals did not meet the exclusion criteria. The numerator are, again, the subgroups of patients who are included in the denominator, and the numerator is the number of patients in an IRF with a discharge self-care score that is equal to or higher than the calculated expected discharge score. So for the self-care measure, all 7 self-care activities are included. So again, eating, oral hygiene, toileting hygiene, shower, bathe self, upper body dressing, lower body dressing, and putting on, taking off footwear. So for this calculation, we'll walk through this. So first of all, there is a calculation of the discharge self-care score after the recoding. So similar to the change measures that we talked about, the first 2 measures. So for self-care, there's 7 activities. And so if somebody got coded a 1 on each of those activities, the total score for self-care would be 7. If somebody was coded a 6 on each of the 7 activities, the total score after recoding would be 6. And so the range can be 7 to 42 for the discharge score. As part of the analysis, obviously, we need to identify the stays that would be excluded. So anybody under 21, for example, anybody with an incomplete stay would be identified and excluded. So at that point, the risk adjustment comes in for this measure. And for each stay, using the admission data, the risk adjuster data, an expected score is calculated for each person. So again, the details are in the manuals, but in general, the data that is risk adjusted, so in the risk adjustment, individuals, let's say, who are 75 to 85 years old generally have less expected improvement based on our data in general than somebody who's 65. So if you had a patient who was 85, based on the analysis that has been done, there are adjusters that are made. And so basically there's an expected score based on all of the patient characteristics. So whether that person had a pressure ulcer, whether the person was a certain age category, what the person's primary diagnosis was, what their admission function score was. So that all comes into play, and an expected score between 7 and 42 is calculated. So we basically have under number 1 an expected score that is between 7 and 42 for each person. So let's say the observed, so what actually happened at discharge, based on your assessment data, is that the person, let's say, had a score of 40. And let's say the expected score was that this person would be a 38 by discharge. So in that case, the observed score, so your patient achieved a discharge self-care score that is higher than what the national data experience expected. And so that person would be included in the numerator. If, however, the observed score was 40 and the expected score would be 41, you're below it, that individual did not achieve as high as the expected, and so that person would not be in the numerator. Does that make sense? Okay. So again, if you're interested in calculating the expected score, please submit a question. I can go into more detail if you're interested at the end of the day, or I guess it's tomorrow. I think we're taking questions about this presentation. I also have documents if you want to know a little bit more details. I can show you some things too. Lots of numbers. But In general, I just want to be sure you have the idea. There's an observed score based on the assessment, and then there's a calculation that happens based on the national experience of an expected score, and it's just, is the observed score higher than, equal to, or higher than the expected score? So basically, number 4 is what I described. We look at the difference between the observed and expected score. We determine the denominator count based on the included records. We determine the numerator count based on the difference between the observed and expected scores. And then there's a calculation at the facility level during the performance period. So let's say it was calendar year 2018, and anybody discharged during that performance period would be included. And so for each patient record, there's a determination of whether that person met or exceeded the national benchmark. And so then there's a count of the percentage of patients who met, a count of the number of people who met or exceeded the national benchmark, and that's turned into a percent with the denominator. And in terms of the reporting, it is rounded just to 1 decimal place. So similar to what I mentioned before about the change in self-care measure, the same risk adjusters for the other self-care measures are also used here. Basically, instead of predicting change in self-care, in this instance, we're predicting the discharge self-care, but that is essentially the same mathematically when you adjust for the admission score. So again, these are all the same things that you saw on the previous slide: age group, primary diagnosis, prior functioning, the pressure ulcers, the communication, cognitive impairment, bowel and bladder function, swallowing abilities, and comorbidities. Again, this is from the document that I mentioned before, and this particular measure is the 3rd column of checks. So I guess it's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6th column over, or second from the left. It's probably easier to think about it that way. But anyway, there's checks, and you can see that, again, all the age groups, as I said, are included in both this measure and 2633, change in self-care. This measure also has exclusion criteria. Essentially, the exclusion criteria are the same as the change in self-care, except the one that probably doesn't apply that much, which is excluding somebody who is independent on admission with all self-care activities. So oftentimes, that doesn't occur, that individuals would be independent on all self-care activities on admission, and so the exclusion criteria essentially end up being the same. So it's the exclusion are people who have incomplete stay, individuals who are admitted in coma or persistent vegetative state, complete tetraplegia, locked-in state, severe anoxic brain damage, cerebral edema or compression of the brain, patients younger than 21 years of age, individuals discharged to hospice, and patients not covered in the Medicare program. Again, if you'd like more details about the measure, calculation, and specifications, please feel free to check out the NQF page with all those details. So the last measure that we're going to cover is 2636. This is the IRF Functional Outcome Measure, Discharge Mobility Score for medical rehabilitation patients. As you can imagine, this is very similar to the self-care measure that we just covered, which was 2635. So again, this is an outcome measure calculated using the data from the IRF-PAI. It estimates the percentage of IRF patients who meet or exceed the expected discharge mobility score. So for the mobility score, we have 15 activities. And so if somebody is coded an 01 on each of those activities, the lowest score would be 15. If somebody is coded a 6 on each of the activities by discharge, that person would have a mobility score of 90. So it's 15 to 90 as the range. The target population for this particular measure is IRF patients who are at least 21 years of age, Medicare beneficiaries, and again, the complete stays. In terms of the information that is required in order to calculate this measure, as with all the other measures, the first box is the section GG, functional assessment data. In the mobility section, GG 0170 that we've covered earlier today. And then the risk adjuster data that comes from the IRF-PAI in various sections. So, for example, section BB has the communication items, section H has the bowel and bladder incontinence items, the BIMS is in section C. So all of those activities, or all of those data that are submitted for those data elements are considered. And then the comorbidities are the ICD codes that are reported in item 24 of the IRF-PAI. Those are also included. And then prior functioning in the early section of GG are also included. So as with the self-care measure, this particular measure, again, has a numerator denominator. I'm going to start with the denominator because that's who's included. And for this measure, you can only be included in the numerator if you're part of the denominator. So the denominator is the total number of Medicare Part A and Medicare Advantage patient stay level IRF-PAI records with a discharge date during the target performance period, which do not meet the exclusion criteria. So among the stays that meet the criteria for being in the denominator, there's a review of each of those records to see the number of patients in the IRF during that period with a discharge mobility score that is equal to or higher than the calculated expected discharge mobility score. So again, another example here, let's say we have one patient who has an observed score of, I'm just going to make this up, 80. And let's say the expected score was 78. With this, an observed score of 80 and an expected score of 78, would they meet or exceed the national benchmark? Yes. That's right, so that person would be in the numerator. Let's say we had a different patient, also had an observed score of 80, but in this case, the expected score was 84. So their observed in this case is lower than the expected score. So based on the national experience, we would have expected they would have gained a little bit more function. So in this case, would they be in the numerator? No. Yeah, so everybody would be included in the denominator who meets the inclusion criteria, and then the numerator is the subset of people who meet or exceed the national benchmark. Does that make sense? So if the person didn't meet the national benchmark for, somebody with a similar diagnosis, similar age group, similar comorbidities, et cetera, they would not be in the numerator in that case. So the mobility activities that are included in this measure are the bed mobility activities, the transfer activities, as well as the walking items, the stairs items, and the pickup object. In case you're curious about this, as part of the recoding, if you, for example, indicate, let's say, that somebody is unable to walk the 10 feet, and so let's say that person is coded 88, and so there's obviously you're going to skip over the 50 feet with 2 turns and the walk 150 feet. I mentioned the skip patterns this morning, or maybe the stairs, they can't go up and down one step, so you skip over the other. So the recoding does consider the skips basically as another activity not attempted code, because that's basically what you're telling us when it's skipped over. So all of the specifications cover all of that. So just walking through this, again, just to make sure that it kind of makes sense to you. So we would start, if you're calculating this measure, you'd start out by calculating the observed discharge mobility score. So again, the 15 data elements are considered. the range, if somebody got coded a 1 at discharge for each of the activities, the lowest code would be 15. If somebody got coded 6 on each of the activities, you'd have a code of, or a score of 90 for that person for the mobility score when it's summed after recoding. You'd identify the excluded stays so that they can be excluded and you only have included stays. You'd then calculate the expected scores based on the risk adjustment, and the risk adjustment, basically, there are published on the CMS website, there are published regression coefficients and intercepts that can be used to calculate that expected score. So the expected score is calculated. You would then calculate basically the difference between the observed and expected to see if the observed was equal to or higher than the expected score. You would determine the denominator count, the number of included records. You would determine the number of individuals who had an expected score that met or exceeded the national benchmark. Their observed score was equal to or better than the national benchmark, and then that's your numerator count. You turn that into a percentage, and again, we're going to round it to 1 decimal place. The risk adjuster variables, as you saw previously, these are the same variables that are included in the change in mobility measure. So you'll see that number 19, history of falls again. Again, based on the analysis, individuals who had a history of falls prior to admission to the IRF stay did tend to have worse mobility outcomes, but not worse self-care outcomes. The table at the back of the document that I was telling you about before, this is the very last column. You can see the check boxes, so the age categories are included in all 4 measures. If you are interested in calculating the expected scores, the coefficients for each of the age groups, so let's say the coefficient that's associated with the age group under 35, it will be different for each measure, but there is a coefficient basically for each measure, and that's why the checkbox is there. That just means it's included, but you actually have to look at the risk adjustment coefficient data in order to calculate the measure to get the actual numbers. So the exclusions, as we talked about before, incomplete stay, certain medical conditions, again, based on expert panels, have provided this feedback to us. Individuals younger than 21, individuals discharged to hospice, and individuals who are not Medicare beneficiaries. More information is available at the NQF website if you're interested in looking at all the details. So I did want to tell you a little bit about where to find this document that I've referred to if you're really interested in looking at this material. So the IRF quality, QRP, Quality Reporting Program Measure Calculations and Reporting Users Manual is available on the website. If you Google or whatever search engine you use, if you do IRF QRP, if you land on that page, on the left side, you have all the different options. So you actually would go to the, let's see, it's IRF Quality Reporting Program Measures Information tab, and that's where you would then scroll to the bottom of the page. There's all the downloads on each page at the bottom of the web page. So as you probably heard multiple times, just go to the bottom of the page, and then this is the current manual that's posted, version 3.0. There are updates that are made over time, so just because you had maybe a manual from several years ago, they probably didn't include the functional outcome measures. They probably had just pressure ulcer if you had version 1.0 from a few years ago. So definitely check when there's updates to measures to get the most recent information. I mentioned that the regression coefficients and intercepts are available if you're really interested in calculating the risk-adjusted values. And so the second kind of box there is risk adjustment appendix file for the IRF measure calculations reporting users manual. If you're interested in looking at the manual, it is a fairly long document. So just to help you navigate, it is sorted by chapters. So the first chapter talks about organization, gives definitions of key terms. Chapter 2 talks about some of the other measures, CDC measures. Chapter 3 is about the claims measures, where you can find more information. Chapter 4 tells you about the selection process, so it's those things like I told you. If the date is calendar year 2018, let me ask you, is it based on admission date or discharge date? Do you remember? Discharge, yeah. So if a measure for the functional outcomes is calculated for calendar year 2018, it's individuals discharged in calendar year 2018. Next chapter is talks about some of the reporting data that's available. Chapter 6 talks about the calculation process. There's more logic available in Chapter 7, and then Appendix A is kind of that table that I showed you. All of that is right there. So in summary, the functional outcome measures includes one process measure, and the process measure is basically looking at selected GG items and determines basically the percent of records where the self-care and mobility data for those selected items are included at admission and discharge if it's a complete stay, and there's at least one self-care or mobility goal. And then for the discharge, for the outcome measures, which are obviously a little bit more complicated, and I spent a lot more time on those during this presentation. So basically, there's change in self-care measure that looks at the risk-adjusted change between admission discharge for self-care, the change in mobility score for medical rehabilitation patients, which is basically the change in the mobility ability of patients on average, again, risk-adjusted, and then the discharge self-care score and discharge mobility score are percent values, and it represents the percent of patients who met or exceeded the expected self-care or mobility score. So part of the presentation early on, I'll just revisit that the key components of quality measures are target population. So I spent a lot of time talking about that for each measure. Some measures have numerator denominators. Obviously the last two, well, the process measure and then the last two outcome measures have a numerator denominator, and there are exclusion for most of the measures, the outcome measures. Data elements obviously necessary for all of the quality measures. Risk adjustment applies to the outcome measures, and there are calculation algorithms for each. So with that, there is a link if you're interested in more information. Again, I encourage you to submit questions if you have any, and I'll be happy to address them tomorrow. If you have complicated questions, definitely come see me. Happy to help you, show you some more numbers if you're interested. So with that, I think I am turning it back to Bridget, or to Karen. Yes. Thank you, Karen. And again, encourage you to submit your action plan IDs if you're interested.